Now here's a little snippet for you. If you watched my video of me bike packing to the township of Walla Walla, I'll link it up here. I told the story of the Bushranger, Dan Morgan. And now Dan Morgan, he shot dead a police sergeant, Sargeant David Maginnity. Later on, I visited Manus Lake, and on the way home, I visited the Sargeant David Maginnity Memorial, and I'll link that one up here too, so you can hear more of the story. So just to quickly recap, Bushrangers were the outlaws in Australia who were highwaymen, they were robbers and thieves, cattle rustlers, horse rustlers, and they roamed the Australian bush for around 100 years in the 1800s to the early 1900s. Now Dan Morgan, as I said, shot dead Sargeant David Maginnity, and in fact he shot 2 policemen and a civilian, and so he was hunted down by the police and he was shot and killed by a farmhand that was part of the police posse, and that was in 1865. Now in my video I mentioned that a couple of the customers at my workplace had the name of Maginnity, and that I'd asked them if they were related to the Sargeant David Maginnity shot by Dan Morgan. And our customer named Brian Maginnity is the great-great-grandson of Sargeant David Maginnity. How amazing is that? I felt a bit rude asking him, but he seemed okay on relaying some of his family history to me and answered any questions I had quite happily. And this is what Brian told me. Of Irish descent, Sargeant David Maginnity emigrated to Australia in the 1840s. He married a lady called Mary Egan in New South Wales in 1855. Now Mary and David had 5 children. Unfortunately, David wasn't to meet his 5th child. Ellen was born 10 weeks after David was shot dead. Sadly, Ellen died at 7 months from dysentery. After David was shot, the police weren't very kind to Mary, and they evicted her and the children from their police house, which was pretty mean. In the late 1870s, Mary became the first landlady of the Tintaldra Hotel, and that pub remained in Maginnity hands up to very recent times. Mary lived to a great old age of 93 and passed away in Albury, where I live, in 1928. The 4 surviving children of David and Mary, that was Mary Agnes, Rosanna, David, another David, and Susanna Bridget. David Jr., I'll call him, grew up to marry Catherine Rankin in 1900, again in Albury. And David and Catherine went on to have 9 children, can you believe? Their son, Francis, married a lady called Enid Ryan in 1929, who went on to have 3 children. Well, as far as I can tell, there was 3 children. One of those children was our customer, Brian Maginnity. So thanks to Brian, a little bit of Sargeant David Maginnity was brought alive by his tale that he told me. I couldn't write it all down quick enough because obviously I was supposed to be working, and we were actually repairing the DPF on his Holden Captiva. He'd come in to pay, so I felt bad giving him a big bill and grilling him about his family, but he was very happy to relay all this information to me, and I found it so very interesting and so fascinating that he's got a family history so richly and vividly ingrained in Australian history, the time of the Bushrangers. So while I'm rejoicing at this very interesting family history, I have to remember that this was all because of a murder. So my condolences to the Maginnity family, and my thanks to Brian for telling me what he knew of his family history. So while I'm talking about bushrangers, I may as well tell you the story that I'd prepared ages ago, but I never actually read it to you. Now, this one is all about a bushranger named Harry Redford. Now, Harry was said to be a charismatic and cunning bushranger and gained the nickname Captain Starlight, which I find quite funny. Now, little is known about his early years, but he grew up in rural areas, and like many that went on to become bushrangers, knew all about cattle and horses and cattle stations. Harry moved up to Queensland, that's further up north than where he was born, and he worked on a remote cattle station. And it dawned on him that it was so remote that he could steal some of the cattle and sell them himself. Harry gained notoriety for his involvement in cattle rustling, particularly on large-scale operations across the Australian outback. And he was known for his ability to rustle cattle without leaving any trace at all. Now, his most famous exploit was the Great Cattle Drive of 1870. Along with his gang, Harry undertook the audacious task of driving 1,000 head of stolen cattle from Bowen Downs Station in Queensland all the way down to where I am now in South Australia, which is a distance of more than 1,200 miles. Now, the gang made a bit of a mistake because they thought to keep the cattle quiet, they'd bring along a bull, but it was to prove their downfall. To evade capture during the cattle drive, Redford and his gang adopted various disguises and aliases. They presented themselves as legitimate drovers using forged documents. I mean, how did they forge documents back in the 1800s? Seriously, how did they do it? And they were very smooth talking and managed to avoid suspicion. Now, this great cattle drive was across unforgiving and harsh Australian outback terrain. Now, despite their efforts to conceal their activities, Harry and his gang were eventually discovered near Blanchwater Station in South Australia, so they got a whole long way. It's pretty amazing. I know they were thieves, I'm not saying it was right or whatever, but it was a pretty amazing feat. And after a pursuit, they were eventually captured by law enforcement and were arrested. Now, Harry stood trial for his organising this great cattle theft, but he managed to secure an acquittal. And it is said that the judge was so impressed with such an audacious theft that helped him secure this acquittal due to lack of evidence, it is said. The trial gained significant media attention and further added to Harry Redford's legendary status. And I guess that was because there'd be people saying, but he's a thief and he should be prosecuted. And others, you know, like the judge, thinking, well, he must be an amazing person because he stole 1,000 head of cattle and drove them 1,200 miles. Now, following his acquittal, Harry faded from the public eye. Some reports suggest he returned to cattle farming, while others claim he continued his life of crime. So Harry Redford's exploits as Captain Starlight have become stuff of legend in Australian folklore. His daring cattle drives and his ability to outwit the authorities have inspired numerous books, films and songs, ensuring his place in the annals of the Australian bushranger history. It's said that Harry died by drowning in 1901, and a stone cairn marks his final resting place. Some say in Queensland, some say in the Northern Territory. And so that is the story of Harry Redford and his audacious cattle drive. Anyway, I'm going to get to bed now, so I hope you enjoyed that little tale and my update on Brian Maginnity.